It was the third day of the annual corporate retreat, one of those remote luxury estates reserved for top executives and the selected few they favored. The air smelled faintly of pine and old money, glasses clinked. Golf carts hummed in the background. Inside the Grand Lodge, an oversized mahogany table stood at the center of a lounge where the elite mingled, their voices trailing in self-satisfied laughter. Over in the corner sat the CEO, legs crossed, nursing a glass of aged scotch as he glanced around the room for the next piece of amusement. That's when his eyes landed on her. She'd been working for the company in silence for years, though never on the payroll. Not in the way they were. She wore the uniform of the help, charcoal, gray slacks, white blouse slightly faded, a name tag that simply read Dolores. She moved efficiently between tables with the kind of grace that goes unnoticed until you look for it. Coffee refilled, napkins replaced, trash gone before you realized it was there. She was black, quiet, and deliberately unremarkable, exactly the type they didn't think about unless something went wrong. The CEO smirked and waved her over with a slight flick of his fingers, the kind of gesture that demanded compliance without words. She approached with the same expressionless face she always wore, the one that neither invited nor discouraged interaction. "You ever play chess, Dolores?" he asked, voice dripping with faux curiosity, loud enough for nearby executives to catch the question. A few turned their heads, mildly intrigued. She looked at the board on the table, already arranged. White and black pieces standing ready like troops before battle. "Yes," she said. The smirk grew. "Really? You know the rules and all." "I do," she answered, tone as dry as the air-conditioned room. He chuckled, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Then let's play a round. I need a break from beating these Harvard guys." A few of his colleagues laughed, one with a chuckle too loud, the kind that signals discomfort masked as agreement. Someone poured more scotch. Dolores didn't hesitate. She sat down, no confusion, no trace of surprise or unease. Just lowered herself into the chair like she belonged there, hands folded in her lap until the CEO waved her forward. "You can be white," he offered magnanimously, ladies first. She nodded, adjusted a pawn, and made the first move without comment. He mirrored her move, already preparing to dazzle. It wasn't about winning, not really. It was about the theater of it, the joke, the performance, the moment they'd all retell at dinner later, the time the maid thought she could outsmart a Fortune 500 titan on the chessboard, but something in her posture didn't match the story he'd already started writing in his head. She didn't play tentatively, she didn't ask questions, her hands moved with rhythm, with memory. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't checking the board like it was a puzzle to solve. She was simply playing. Not performing, not proving, just playing. The CEO leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. He moved a bishop to test her. She didn't blink. She repositioned her knight, closing a gap in her defense. The move wasn't aggressive, but it was correct. He felt a flicker of irritation. The game wore on. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The casual circle around them grew larger. Conversations quieted. Some took out phones, pretending to scroll while peeking at the match. The laughter had stopped. The room didn't know what it was watching yet, but it knew something was off. He sacrificed a pawn to bait her queen. She ignored it. Instead, she locked down the center of the board, subtly boxing him in. His next move required more thought than he expected. His forehead creased slightly. "You play with your husband or something?" he asked, voice lighter than it needed to be. "No," she said, not offering more. He nodded to himself and took another sip of scotch. She countered with a rook. He leaned back, reevaluating. The first grin had vanished. Now he looked like he was solving something unfamiliar. Like trying to read a memo written in a language he didn't know he didn't speak. Still, he told himself it was fine, just a fluke, just a maid with lucky instincts. Maybe she watched YouTube. Maybe she memorized a few openings. That's all it was, nothing to worry about, until she captured his knight without blinking. Then his bishop, and then silence. Dolores didn't react the way they expected. No awkward laugh, no timid wave of the hand to decline politely. No muttered excuse about needing to finish clearing dishes or returning to the kitchen. She looked at the chessboard, then at the CEO, and simply nodded once, like he'd asked her to pass the salt. A small, composed movement, one that defied the room's anticipation. No one knew quite what to make of it. She pulled the chair back quietly and sat down, her spine straight, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Her expression remained unreadable, calm in the way that unsettled people who were used to seeing service staff either overly cheerful or invisibly neutral, but this wasn't that, it was something else. Something quietly assured, as though she already understood the script they were playing out and had decided not to follow it. She didn't comment on the board, didn't ask questions, didn't look to the CEO or the watching executives for approval or instruction. She simply watched him, silently waiting for him to begin, like the match had been preordained and he was now late for his part. The CEO let out a chuckle that barely masked his growing curiosity. There was a flicker of something he hadn't expected. He'd imagined she'd fumble, hesitate, laugh nervously, or wave it off, anything that would affirm the assumption baked into his invitation. But instead, he was faced with a woman who seemed neither eager to impress nor intimidated by the attention now drawn to her. He motioned again for her to make the first move. White goes first, he reminded her, voice just loud enough to pull in a few more observers around the table. Dolores reached for the pawn in front of her king and moved it forward 2 spaces. Clean, deliberate. She withdrew her hand like a trained pianist, lifting her fingers off the keys after the first note. No unnecessary flair, no visible hesitation, just clarity. There was something in the way she held herself, in the way her fingers brushed the carved wooden pieces. It wasn't familiarity in the way an old man holds a pipe or a woman pulls out knitting needles. It was precision without display, an economy of motion that didn't need to announce itself. She wasn't trying to prove anything. That was what threw people off. No one knew anything about Dolores. They had seen her over the years at these events, refilling drinks, collecting empty glasses, resetting linens between sessions. Some vaguely remembered that she'd been around for over a decade, maybe more. But they'd never stopped to ask how long she'd worked there, or where she lived, or if she had a family. She existed in their periphery, performing tasks they required without requiring their attention. A moving fixture in the background of their success stories. Now she was at the center of the room, and the center couldn't seem to hold. She played her next move after the CEO responded. No delay, no furrowed brow, no glance at the board like she was doing mental math. Just one move after another, like ticking off steps in a sequence she knew by heart. The game began to gain shape, and she shaped it without looking like she was trying. He leaned back, perhaps to regain some psychological advantage. But her presence didn't shift, her face calm, her breathing even. She didn't banter, didn't try to disarm the moment with conversation, didn't perform gratitude or modesty. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was direction. She was there to play chess, and that was it. A junior executive whispered something to another by the fireplace. 2 others near the drinks table stopped mid-conversation to watch. The staff, for their part, continued their duties, but a few paused at the edges, trays held at their waists, eyes flicking toward the board. Dolores moved another piece. The CEO hesitated, not long, but long enough to notice. He scratched his jaw, pretending to evaluate options, but his eyebrows gave away a slight, unconscious rise. He was adjusting, recalibrating. There was no way she should have known the line he was playing. Not unless she had seen it before, not unless she'd studied it. But she didn't look like someone who'd studied theory in books or played on digital platforms. That's what made it stranger. She looked like someone who simply knew things. Knew them in the bones, not from a course or a coach, but from repetition and silence and watching in time. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. When he tried to make eye contact, she returned it without challenge or subservience, just directness. It was unsettling in its quiet certainty, like she'd already seen the path they were on, like this wasn't new to her, like this wasn't even surprising. The pieces moved with a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed, but there was no trace of performance in Dolores's demeanor. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to see the whole board clearly, her fingers touching the tops of the pawns like she was checking the temperature of water she already knew would be right. Every move she made was deliberate, yet fluid, quiet in execution, but thunderous in implication. No hesitation, no second glances. She played like someone who had nothing to prove and everything already understood. The CEO made his plays with the confidence of a man used to controlling rooms, decisions, and outcomes. He leaned into the board after every move she made, eyes narrowing, trying to locate the weak spots he assumed would reveal themselves. She had to misstep eventually. That was how these things went. He'd seen it 100 times. In the boardroom, at negotiations, even at cocktail hour debates. People who didn't belong would always signal it sooner or later. A tremble in the voice, a stray comment, a bad call made under pressure, but it wasn't happening here. Dolores wasn't just playing to keep up. She was steering the pace. Her tempo was steady, unchanging, and it began to influence his own. The CEO, who had started with playful jabs and smug remarks, was quiet now. He studied the board with more intensity than he had in his last 3 strategy sessions combined. She had created a position that wasn't just defensive, but poised, waiting. And what unnerved him most was the sense that she had seen his next few moves before he made them. She wasn't reacting, she was anticipating. Each time he leaned in to make his move, she would lean back slightly, her hands folded, eyes on the board but never frantic. Her knight rotated smoothly across the squares, claiming space that he hadn't expected to need defending. A bishop blocked his advance on the king's side, cutting off lanes he thought were safe. Her rook had settled into a central file like it had lived there all along. The room had grown quieter. People weren't watching with the same casual amusement anymore. No one was checking their phones or whispering about weekend plans. They were leaning in, eyebrows raised, mouths slightly parted. The laughter from earlier was gone, and in its place was the kind of silence that only arrived when people began to sense that they had misread something deeply. What was supposed to be a small indulgence in the CEO's usual gamesmanship had taken on another tone entirely. He made a bold move, a sacrifice. It was supposed to disrupt her balance, throw off the pattern she'd been laying down. It was the kind of aggressive gesture that usually forced opponents into a scramble. She responded in less than 10 seconds. She took the offered piece, repositioned her defense, and in 2 moves neutralized his initiative. The sacrifice meant nothing now, just another piece off the board, a miscalculation. Her expression never changed. There was no smile of satisfaction, no raised brow, no glance around the room to gauge the impact of what she'd done. She didn't seem concerned with anyone else's perception, least of all the man sitting across from her. To her, it was just another sequence, another step forward. The CEO started taking longer. He tapped one finger on the table, then rubbed his chin. His leg bounced beneath the table, almost imperceptibly. He wasn't used to being unsure. He wasn't used to needing this much time. From the outside, he still looked composed, polished, the picture of focus. But a sharp observer would have noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked too quickly from piece to piece, searching for something that wasn't there. She moved her queen diagonally, pinning his rook to his king. It wasn't a flashy move. It didn't scream check or trap, but it forced him to pivot. He frowned slightly. A bead of sweat appeared on his temple. He hadn't noticed it, but others had. Around them, chairs shifted as executives stood silently, one by one, creating a loose circle that grew with every turn. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Everyone in the room felt it, that subtle reordering of power, of understanding. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't claimed her space. She simply took it, one square at a time, without fanfare or permission. He moved a pawn in frustration. a defensive measure meant to delay rather than resolve. She answered with a knight, repositioning again, smoothly, effortlessly, as though the whole match had been unfolding exactly as she planned. The atmosphere shifted gradually, like a fog lifting to reveal a truth too plain to deny. At first, the tension was subtle, noticed only by the more observant onlookers who had stopped mingling and begun watching. But as the pieces disappeared from the board, one by one, the weight in the room became harder to ignore. Each of the CEO moves now carried the echo of hesitation, a sharp contrast to the cocky, fluid gestures from earlier, his brow furrowed deeper with every response she gave him. He would glance at the board, then at her, as if trying to uncover some clue that would explain what was happening. Dolores remained still, her hands occasionally brushing over the table's edge, never fidgeting. Her focus never wavered. She didn't glance at the audience forming around them, didn't smile or acknowledge the eyes that now watched her with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. She didn't play faster to show confidence or slower to imply control. She played at the same steady rhythm she started with, a cadence unshaken by her opponent's status or the room's growing discomfort. She wasn't just answering his strategy, she was dismantling it, piece by quiet piece. The CEO began shifting in his seat more often. He sat forward, then leaned back, adjusted his sleeves, took a sip of water he didn't need. His earlier jokes had dried up entirely, the banter was gone. In its place was a silence he hadn't intended, one that demanded acknowledgement. He'd expected to win quickly, then use the story as a moment of charm and irony later on, something to chuckle about during the final night's toast. Instead, he was on the defensive, and the board made that clear. She had locked down the center. His rooks had been forced to the corners, limited in mobility, ineffective in their placements. Her pawns, like patient workers, had formed a wall he hadn't seen coming until it was too late. Her queen never lunged, never overextended, but hovered always just where she needed to be, waiting, guiding. The balance of control was no longer in question. A few of the executives who had wandered into the room with glasses of bourbon or wine now stood behind the CEO, peering over his shoulder. No one spoke. The air felt too sharp for commentary. Everyone could see what was happening. He had underestimated her, and it was no longer possible to pretend otherwise, not with the board as the witness. A particularly audacious attempt to recapture initiative, a rook swung across the board to challenge her queen, was met with a quiet counter that pinned his bishop in place. It was elegant, effortless. She didn't even pause after his move. It was as though she had seen it coming 3 moves prior. She adjusted a single knight, and suddenly he had no good responses, no way forward that didn't cost him something meaningful. His breathing grew more audible, not panicked yet, but definitely louder than before. He wiped his palms discreetly against the legs of his trousers, hoping it would go unnoticed. It didn't. Dolores, still expressionless, waited for him to move. She didn't rush him, didn't fill the silence with any polite noises or small talk. She gave him space, the way one gives space to someone realizing they've walked into a room they no longer control. She did not shrink from his gaze when he finally looked up to meet her eyes. Her stare was calm, not smug, not challenging, just present. Undeniably, unavoidably present. The spectators around them had changed in demeanor too. What began as a moment of shared entertainment had shifted into something else entirely. Some folded their arms, others exchanged brief glances, uncertain whether to keep watching or leave. No one laughed anymore. The silence had become instructional, each turn a kind of unspoken correction to something deeper than a game. He touched a bishop, held it, and then let it go, thought better of it, moved a pawn instead, one of the few pieces left with mobility. She took it with a rook, no hesitation. Then she looked down at the board, not at him, waiting again. As if this entire match was nothing more than a conversation she had been invited to join, one she had every right to speak in. Every time he tried to shift momentum, she absorbed it. Every tactical jab he attempted was quietly deflected, repurposed, or rendered irrelevant. She never played theatrically, never showed emotion, but with each piece he lost, something in the room felt heavier, more permanent. His assumptions were no longer theory, they were laid bare as miscalculations. And still, she made no attempt to capitalize on the moment socially. She didn't ask for respect. She didn't demand recognition. She just kept playing, steady, inevitable. The silence had matured into something dense and absolute, a quiet so charged it seemed to press against the walls of the lodge. No one dared to speak now, not even in whispers. The game that had begun as a moment of casual spectacle had transfigured into something intimate and unavoidable, something raw. The line between observer and participant blurred. Everyone in the room felt the weight of what was unfolding, as though they themselves were under scrutiny. As though the board was holding up a mirror, Dolores did not appear aware of the attention, though she certainly registered it. She didn't react. Her posture remained unchanged, her face composed. Every motion she made was precise, efficient, and unhurried. She had the rare presence of someone who did not need to perform competence. She simply inhabited it. Her fingers moved a rook, sliding it cleanly into position, and without fanfare, she restricted the CEO king again. It wasn't an obvious trap, not yet, but it was tightening. Every square he touched narrowed the horizon. Those who had first watched with smirks or mild amusement now stood with their arms crossed, jaws set, eyes narrowed. They weren't looking at her the same way anymore. They weren't even watching the pieces. They were watching her, trying to place her, trying to reconcile the figure in front of them with the assumptions they'd carried into the room. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. Something was being redefined, and not just on the chessboard. The CEO shifted again, the back of his neck now visibly damp. The charm, the assured smile, the effortless superiority had slipped away. In its place was a man slowly realizing he had invited something into the room that he could no longer control. He rubbed at his temple, leaned forward, and stared at the board as though it might offer him forgiveness. His king had only a few legal squares left, each less promising than the last. Dolores remained motionless except when it was her turn. Her eyes moved with the tempo of someone not hunting, not pushing, but waiting, watching something unfold exactly as it must. The game had never been about aggression for her. It was containment, precision, understanding. While he had entered into it for the performance, she had walked in with knowledge of the board, of the man across from her, and of the room that watched them both. Another piece fell, a knight this time. He tried to mount a counter, hoping to open up a flank, but she had seen it before he moved. Her queen intercepted it, and just like that, the last of his coordinated threats had evaporated. He paused again, staring at the table as if willing a mistake to appear on her side. But there was none, no cracks, no waste, just pure, sustained control. The faces around them bore the tension differently. Some watched with awe, others with a faint discomfort they couldn't name. The ones who had laughed loudest earlier now looked uneasy. What had begun as a joke had morphed into an exposure, and they were complicit in its setup. They had seen her only as she had been labeled, not as she had revealed herself. That revelation now rang out silently across the room, louder than any declaration could have. A young VP at the back, one of the newer ones, blinked rapidly as he stared at the board, eyes moving from piece to piece, trying to understand the sequence. He mouthed something, probably a curse, but said nothing. A senior partner next to him shifted his stance and let out a slow breath through his nose. The story they thought they were watching had turned, and no one knew quite how to frame it anymore. Dolores didn't look up, didn't gloat. Her gaze stayed low, trained on the board, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table when they weren't in motion. The CEO, by contrast, now avoided eye contact with anyone. His focus had collapsed inward, trying to salvage pride from a situation that had eroded it square by square. He played slower, more cautiously, but it wasn't strategy anymore, it was survival, delay, hoping to postpone a conclusion that was already apparent. The board, once a site of casual play, now served as a reckoning. Every piece left on it carried more than tactical value. It carried meaning. His queen, cornered and ineffective, his rooks, pinned or barricaded, his king, hemmed in. Her side of the board, by contrast, was organized, firm, elegant in its geometry. Not overreaching, not flamboyant, just inevitable. There was no dramatic check, no raised voice, no clatter of pieces, just the slow, relentless narrowing of his options, just the stillness of her resolve, just the silence of a room that had, without anyone saying it, decided this was not about the game anymore.